You're a maid. Why are you risking everything for me?
Because you are a good man.
The maid who saved the prince, the forbidden whisper. The palace of Kangwon rose majestically against the misty mountains, a perfect blend of ancient tradition and quiet elegance. Lanterns swayed gently in the winter wind, casting warm light across the stone courtyards. Inside, every corridor whispered secrets of royalty. Every door held the weight of centuries. Prince Junhyuk, the young heir, walked alone through the outer garden, his silk robes damp from the rain. Tonight was not a night for a prince to wander, but he could not bear the suffocating walls of protocol, the endless expectations. He longed for even a single moment of freedom, a single choice of his own. Meanwhile, Amara Johnson moved silently through the palace halls, her steps careful but purposeful. Her dark eyes caught every shadow, every flicker of movement. Though she had arrived in Korea to serve as a maid, she had never expected to become part of the palace's hidden heart, to witness its secrets and dangers as she carried a tray of tea to the prince's private quarters. Her ears caught a muffled shout. Curiosity tugged at her stronger than caution. She followed the sound to the moonlit garden and froze. Prince Junhyuk was cornered, surrounded by palace guards, their swords glinting under the rain-soaked lanterns. Fear gripped her chest, but she acted without thinking. She dropped the tray and dashed forward, weaving through the guards with the agility that came from years of quietly observing palace life. Your Highness, this way, quickly, she hissed, grabbing his hand. Prince Junhyuk's eyes widened. Amara, how? No time, she said, tugging him toward the hidden tunnels beneath the palace. Secret paths used only by servants in emergencies. The stone walls were cold against their hands, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. Every step felt like defying fate itself. Once they reached a secluded pavilion at the edge of the palace garden, safe for the moment. They collapsed, soaked to the bone. Lantern light flickered across Amara's face, illuminating the courage in her eyes, the strength in her stance. The prince stared at her, speechless. You risked yourself for me. His voice was low, almost reverent. Amara's lips curved into a gentle smile. Because no one deserves to be trapped by walls, even if they are made of gold and silk, she said softly. A quiet moment passed. The rain outside drummed steadily, a soothing rhythm against the chaos of their hearts. Prince Junhyuk realized he had never truly looked at her before, not like this. Her presence was magnetic, comforting, and startling all at once. You are unlike anyone I've ever met, he said, his voice trembling slightly, betraying both gratitude and something deeper, something he was only beginning to understand. Amara's cheeks flushed under the weight of his gaze. And you, Your Highness, are braver than anyone I've ever served, she whispered. For the first time, the walls between prince and maid, between two worlds, seemed to vanish. Fear, danger, and the storm outside fused into a strange, thrilling intimacy. A bond had been formed not out of obligation or duty, but from trust, courage, and the spark of something neither of them could name yet. But even in this fragile sanctuary, shadows lingered. The palace was alive with whispers, intrigue, and threats that would not rest until the prince was back under their control. The night was far from over, and so, with hearts pounding and drenched in rain, Prince Junhyuk and Amara prepared to face the night together, two souls united by chance, courage, and the first flicker of a forbidden affection. The rain had ceased, leaving the palace garden glistening under a crescent moon. Mist curled around the stone paths like ghostly fingers. Prince Junhyuk and Amara crouched behind the pavilion's wooden beams, listening to the distant clatter of guards searching for them. Every sound was amplified in the quiet night, the creak of a lantern, the soft splash of water against stone. Amara's heart raced, but her mind was sharp. She had studied the palace since her arrival, memorizing secret passages, hidden doors, and unused staircases. Now all that knowledge would save the prince. We have to move, she whispered, grabbing his hand again. There's a tunnel near the west wing. It leads outside the palace walls. Junhyuk nodded, trusting her completely. His usual confidence as a prince had no place here. He was a young man guided by courage and the hand of a brave maid. They slipped through the shadows, Amara leading the way, her steps silent and deliberate. The palace seemed alive with danger. Guards turned corners, whispers echoed through hallways, and the air smelled of rain and tension. As they reached the west wing, a guard suddenly appeared at the corridor's end, sword drawn. Amara's eyes darted around. There was no time for hesitation. Hide, she hissed, pulling the prince into a small alcove behind a decorative screen. The guard paused, scanning the corridor, then moved on, unaware of the two bodies pressed into the shadows. Junhyuk exhaled shakily. You're incredible, he murmured, his hand brushing hers accidentally. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through both of them, a spark that made their hearts pound even faster than the fear of discovery. Amara's lips curved into a small smile. We're not safe yet, she said softly. Keep focused. Finally, they reached the hidden tunnel, a narrow passage covered in vines and shadows. Amara pushed aside a loose stone, revealing the secret exit. They climbed through, emerging into the cold, open night beyond the palace. Walls the air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. For a moment, they simply stood there catching their breath, looking at the moonlit mountains. June Hyuk's usual composure had melted, replaced by awe and gratitude. "You saved my life," he said, his voice low, almost breaking. I don't know how to thank you." Amara looked at him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "You don't have to," she whispered. "Just promise me you'll be careful from now on." For the first time, their hands intertwined. Deliberately, a silence fell, filled with unspoken words and a shared heartbeat. In the quiet, away from palace walls and duties, they were just two people, vulnerable, human, and utterly connected. But even as relief washed over them, the danger was far from over. Rumors of rebellion and betrayal were spreading within the palace walls. The prince could not remain in hiding forever, and Amara, she had just begun to realize that her heart had left a permanent mark on him, and he on her. As they walked through the moonlit forest toward safety, the world felt simultaneously enormous and intimate. Every brush of their hands, every glance carried a weight of trust, courage, and something that neither dared name aloud yet, but both could feel perfect now. We'll dive into part 3, where the stakes heighten, danger intensifies, and the romance between Amara and Prince Junhyuk deepens. Painful, sweet, and cinematic. I'll make it emotionally gripping, like a traditional movie turning point. The forest outside the palace whispered with the night wind, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. Moonlight streamed through the branches, casting silvery patterns on the ground. Prince Junhyuk and Amara moved cautiously, but each step felt heavier than the last. The prince's usual confidence was tempered by fear, and Amara's determination was tinged with exhaustion. "Are we far enough?" Junhyuk asked quietly, his voice almost drowned by the rustle of leaves. "For now," Amara replied, her hand still tightly gripping his butt. "They will come for you. We need a safe place to regroup." They reached a small abandoned shrine at the forest's edge. Its wooden pillars were weathered, moss growing along the steps. Here they paused, leaning against each other for support. For a moment, the world outside the palace, betrayal, danger, did not exist. "I can't lose you," Junhyuk admitted, his voice breaking as he stared into her eyes. "If anything happens to you, I don't know what I would do." Amara's breath caught. She brushed a strand of wet hair from his forehead, her hand lingering on his cheek. "You won't lose me," she whispered. "Not now, not ever." But the night was cruel, and fate had not finished its trials. Suddenly, the snapping of branches echoed through the forest. Shadows moved, armed men emerging from the darkness. Palace guards who had discovered their escape route. "Run!" Amara shouted, pulling Junhyuk toward a narrow path winding deeper into the woods. Their feet pounded the earth, hearts racing in sync. Every step was perilous. One wrong move could mean capture, or worse. They reached a cliff overlooking a quiet river, the moonlight reflecting off the water like shattered silver. Ahead was freedom. If only they could descend safely. Amara looked at Junhyuk, her eyes filled with both fear and resolve. "I will not let them take you," she said fiercely. "Hold on to me, whatever happens." With that, she led him down the rocky path, carefully navigating slippery stones. A guard lunged from behind, but Amara, swift and fearless, used a fallen branch to trip him, giving them precious seconds. Junhyuk's heart pounded, not just from fear but from admiration and a growing affection he could no longer deny. They reached the river's edge, soaking wet and breathless. For a fleeting moment, the danger seemed to vanish. Junhyuk took her hands in his, holding them tightly. "Amara, I know," she interrupted softly, a tear running down her cheek. "I feel it too." Their eyes met, and in that fragile, suspended moment, the world disappeared. The prince, bound by duty and tradition, and the maid, courageous and free-spirited, found solace in each other's embrace. It was sweet, it was heart-stopping, and it was forbidden, but it was real. Yet reality crashed back. A distant shout reminded them that the palace's reach was long, and they were not safe yet. As they huddled together, plotting their next move, both understood the truth. The path ahead would be painful. Loyalties would be tested, sacrifices made, and their love would be challenged by forces far beyond them. But even in that darkness, one thing was certain: they had found each other. Spark born in fear, nurtured in courage, would not be extinguished. Absolutely. Here's part for the climax and resolution of your story. This part will be cinematic, emotional, and heart-melting, highlighting Amara's courage, the prince's vulnerability, and the sweetness of their love, overcoming danger. Dawn broke over the forest, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The night's rain had left the earth glistening, and the river shimmered like molten silver. Prince Junhyuk and Amara crouched behind a boulder, exhausted but alive. Their bodies were bruised and soaked, yet their hearts beat fiercely, not just from fear but from a bond forged in the fire of danger. "They'll be back," Amara whispered, scanning the horizon. "We can't linger here, but I know a place, a hidden temple abandoned for decades. We can rest there and plan our next move." Junhyuk nodded, his hand gripping hers. "Lead the way," he said, his voice steady, now tinged with admiration and something deeper something he could no longer hide as. They navigated the forest, the palace guards relentless in their pursuit grew closer. They had underestimated Amara with keen intelligence and resourcefulness. She led the prince through treacherous paths, using knowledge of hidden trails, fallen trees, and river bends to their advantage. Every clever maneuver kept them one step ahead of danger. Finally, they reached the hidden temple. Its moss-covered walls and crumbling gates spoke of time forgotten. Here they were safe, at least for a while. The prince collapsed onto the stone floor, chest heaving, and Amara knelt beside him, checking him for injuries. "You saved my life every step of the way," Jun Hyuk said, his voice choked with emotion. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Amara placed a hand over his heart. "You don't need to. Your life is worth more than any reward. That's enough for me." A silence fell between them, filled with unspoken feelings. Then slowly Jun Hyuk reached for her hand again, holding it, as though he could anchor himself to her. "Courage, Amara. I don't care about tradition or titles or the rules that bind me," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "All I care about is you. I love you." Tears welled in Amara's eyes. "I love you, too," she whispered. "And I've been afraid to admit it, but I can't hide it anymore." For a brief, breathtaking moment, they allowed themselves to forget the world, to exist only in each other's embrace. The danger, the palace, the conspiracies, they melted away, leaving only the purity of their bond. But love, in a world of duty, is never without challenge. Word of their escape eventually reached the palace. Courtiers and guards searched tirelessly, but they were clever, resourceful, and united. Amara's bravery had given them the advantage, and Prince Jun Hyuk's determination to protect both their lives fueled their courage. Days later, under the same pink dawn skies, they returned not as a prince and a maid, but as equals, united in loyalty, bravery, and love. The palace could not erase what they had shared, and even the most rigid traditions began to bend under the undeniable truth. Courage and love transcend all boundaries. In the quiet of the royal gardens, Jun Hyuk took her hands in his once more. "From this day forward, nothing can separate us," he vowed. "You saved men not just from danger, but from a life without choice, without freedom, without love." Amara smiled through tears, brushing her wet hair from her face. "And you saved me too," she whispered, "from a world of walls and limits. Together we are unstoppable under the rising sun." Two worlds collided beautifully, royalty and courage, duty and freedom, tradition and love. And in that moment, Prince Jun Hyuk and Amara Johnson knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, their hearts would face them as one. The palace was quiet now, but not the same. The echoes of the recent chaos lingered like a whisper, rumors of rebellion, whispers of scandal, yet also the undeniable awe of Amara's bravery. The black American maid who had risked everything for the prince had become more than just a servant. She was now a symbol of courage, loyalty, and love that refused to bend to tradition. Prince Jun Hyuk moved through the palace gardens, dressed not in ceremonial robes, but in simpler garments, walking beside Amara. The morning sun spilled gold across the courtyard, glinting off the delicate petals of cherry blossoms. For a moment, the world felt like it belonged only to them. "You know," Jun Hyuk said softly, "I've spent my whole life bound by rules. I never thought I could choose for myself. But you've shown me that courage isn't about swords or titles, it's about the heart." Amara smiled, warmth radiating through her tired but determined eyes. "And you've shown me that love doesn't care about walls or tradition or even fear. It's about trust, about holding on even when everything else is falling apart." Their hands intertwined naturally, fingers lacing together with a quiet intimacy around them. The palace seemed to hold its breath, the wind rustling the trees, as if approving their union. Yet challenges remained. The court murmured, some disapproving, some inspired. For the first time, Jun Hyuk realized that being a prince wasn't just about avoiding danger, it was about making choices that could change everything. And he chose her. "Amara," he said, stopping to look into her eyes, "I want the world to know, no, I need the world to know that you saved me, that you are the one I love and the one I want by my side always." Amara's eyes shimmered with tears, a mixture of relief, joy, and disbelief. "Then let them know," she whispered, "let them see us together." They returned to the palace, not hiding, not fearing whispers, and the world watched as the prince and the maid walked side by side, not just as master and servant, but as equals, partners in courage and in heart. The court could no longer deny the bond that had been forged in fire, rain, and shadow. In the quiet of their private garden later that evening, with lanterns casting soft light on the blossoms around them, Jun Hyuk took her hands once more. "I cannot promise the path will be easy," he said, his voice solemn, "but I promise that no matter what comes, I will face it with you." Amara leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the safety and love she had fought so hard to protect. "And I promise the same," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, "because love like ours, it's worth every risk, every danger, every moment we've survived." The palace, steeped in centuries of tradition, had witnessed the impossible. A love that bridged worlds, defied expectations, and endured, and under the rising moon Prince Junhyuk and Amara Johnson knew that they had not only saved each other, they had created a love story that would be remembered for generations. As they walked hand in hand, laughter and whispered promises filling the air, the world felt both infinite and intimate. Every obstacle, every shadow of betrayal had only made their hearts stronger, and together they would face whatever the future held with courage, with trust, and with a love that was truly unstoppable. The palace hall stood vast and solemn, its ancient wooden pillars stretching upward like silent witnesses to history. Morning sunlight filtered through papered windows, casting soft gold patterns across the polished floor. Ministers, elders, and guards filled the hall, their breaths hushed, their faces tight with expectation. At the center stood Prince Junhyuk. Beside him stood Amara, not as a maid, not as a servant, but as a woman who had faced death and refused to bow to fear. Whispers rippled through the court like distant thunder. A foreigner, a maid standing beside the Prince. Junhyuk stepped forward, his voice steady but heavy with truth. Last night, he began, I learned how fragile power truly is. I was hunted within the walls meant to protect me. Betrayal does not always come with a blade. Sometimes it wears loyalty like a mask. The hall tightened. No one dared interrupt. He turned slightly and looked at Amara, his eyes softening in a way the court had never seen. This woman did not ask who I was. She did not ask what I could give her. She only saw a life in danger, and she chose to stand between me and death. Amara felt her chest tighten. She kept her head high, though tears pressed behind her eyes. When the night was dark, Junhyuk continued, and fear chased us through rain and shadow. She led me with courage, greater than any guard, greater than any sword sworn to me. He faced the throne. Father, he said, not as a prince pleading, but as a son speaking truth. I was born into a crown, but last night I learned what it means to be human. The king's gaze hardened, then softened. He studied Amara closely, her posture, her calm strength, the quiet dig knit up to New York in her eyes. And you, the king said slowly, his voice carrying centuries of rule, why did you save my son? All eyes turned to Amara. She swallowed, then spoke, not loudly but with a strength that filled the room. Because no life is small, she said, and no title is greater than a beating heart. A murmur swept through the hall. The king rose from his throne. He descended the steps, slowly stopping before her. You knew the cost, he said. You knew you could die. Yes, Amara replied. Yet you chose him. Yes. Silence stretched. Then the king turned back to the court. For generations, he said, this palace has honored blood and tradition, but tradition without honor is only habit. The elders shifted uneasily. This woman has shown loyalty beyond birth, courage beyond training, and love beyond borders. He faced Junhyuk. You ask not for permission, the king said, but for truth. And truth has been spoken. The court fell to its knees. A single elder bowed deeply. Let history remember, the elder said, the day courage rewrote tradition. Tears slid freely down Amara's cheeks. Now Junhyuk took her hand openly, without fear. I do not promise an easy road, the king said softly, but I will not stand against a love forged in sacrifice. Junhyuk bowed deeply. I will rule with that same courage, he vowed, or not rule at all. The king nodded once. In that moment the palace changed, not with celebration or applause, but with quiet acceptance. Outside, cherry blossoms drifted down in the courtyard, carried by a gentle wind. As the doors of the hall opened, light poured in, bathing the prince and the woman beside him in gold. They stepped forward together, not as prince and maid, but as two souls who had faced darkness and chosen love. The palace no longer felt like a cage. Morning arrived, gently sunlight spilling over the tiled rooftops and stone courtyards, as if the world itself had decided to begin again. The bells rang softly, not in warning, not in command, but in peace. Servants moved with unhurried steps, guards stood with eased shoulders, and the palace breathed in a way it never had before. Amara stood in the royal garden beside a quiet koi pond where orange and white fish glided beneath the water's surface. Cherry blossoms drifted lazily in the breeze, landing on the stone path at her feet. She wore simple robes, elegant but modest, and for the first time since arriving in this land she felt truly seen, not as a maid, not as a foreigner, but as herself. Footsteps approached behind her, slow, familiar, unguarded. Junhyuk stopped beside her, no crown upon his head, no royal armor weighing down his shoulders. He looked at her not as a prince addressing his court, but as a man choosing his life. I used to walk these gardens alone, he said quietly. Even when surrounded by people, I was alone. Amara turned to him, her eyes soft. And now, he replied, meeting her gaze, I walk with someone who knows My fear and stayed anyway. They stood together in silence, watching the blossoms fall. Each petal felt like a memory drifting gently to rest. The rain-soaked night, the hidden tunnels, the breathless escape. The moment truth was spoken before the court. I was afraid. Amara admitted, not of the danger, but of believing I could belong here. Junhyuk reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. You don't belong here, he said softly. You belong with me, and that makes this place worthy of you. She smiled through tears. Days passed, and the palace learned a new rhythm. Elders observed her with quiet curiosity. Some still whispered, but others bowed their heads in respect. Children in the courtyard smiled at her without fear or judgment, and slowly the weight of the past began to lift. One evening, beneath a sky painted in soft purples and golds, lanterns were lit across the gardens. The air hummed with calm. Junhyuk led Amara to the old pavilion, the same place where rain once soaked their clothes and fear had tightened their breaths. Do you remember? He asked. How could I forget? She replied. He turned to her, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I do not know what kind of king I will become, he said, but I know what kind of man I choose to be. One who listens, one who protects, one who loves without fear. He lowered his forehead to hers, a gesture more intimate than any crown or ceremony. Stay, he whispered, not as someone I saved, but as someone who saved me. Amara closed her eyes, breathing in the stillness, the certainty. The future. I will stay, she said, as long as we walk under the same sky. Above them, the stars began to appear, quiet, eternal witnesses to a love that had crossed borders, broken walls, and rewritten history. And so the story ended, not with a throne, not with triumph, but with two hearts choosing each other again and again in a world that had finally learned to make room for love. Years passed quietly but steadily, like a river that never forgets its source. The palace of Kangwon still stood proud against the mountains, its rooftops catching the sunrise each morning, its courtyards echoing with footsteps of tradition. But something within its ancient walls had changed forever. The air was lighter now, the silence kinder. Amara often walked the palace grounds at dawn. When the world was soft and forgiving, she would pause beneath the old cherry trees, watching petals fall like gentle snow, remembering the night rain once soaked her clothes. As she ran for her life and for his, she was no longer called Maid, she was called Lady Amara, not because of birth, not because of blood, but because the palace had learned that courage could be inherited through action. Prince Junhyuk, now King Junhyuk, ruled differently than those before him. He listened more than he commanded. He walked among the people without ceremony. When he sat on the throne, his eyes carried memory, not pride. Often during long council meetings, his gaze would drift toward the open doors where Amara sometimes stood quietly watching the world they had survived together. She never sought power, that was why power trusted her. Children in the palace grew up hearing her name spoken with reverence. Servants told stories in hushed tones. At night, she stood between a sword and the crown. She chose love. When fear ruled the night, she changed the course of a kingdom without lifting a weapon. On quiet evenings, when the lanterns glowed low and the mountains were shadows against the stars, Junhyuk and Amara would return to the garden where everything had begun. They would sit side by side, close but unguarded. Do you ever miss the life before this? Junhyuk once asked, his voice barely above the wind. Amara smiled softly. I miss who I was before I knew fear, she said, but I would never trade who I became by loving you. He took her hand, not as a king claiming comfort, but as a man still choosing her. That every day I ruled a kingdom, he said quietly, but you taught me how to belong to it. Seasons turned, spring brought blossoms and laughter, summer brought festivals and open gates, autumn brought reflection, winter brought stillness and firelight. Conversations that lasted until dawn, and through every season they remained unchanged in the ways that mattered. They never forgot the night of rain, they never forgot the fear, they never forgot the choice. Years later, when their hair bore strands of silver and their steps slowed, they stood once more before the palace gates, this time watching young people pass freely in and out, unafraid, hopeful. Do you think they know? Amara asked. Know what? Junhyuk replied, that love was once forbidden here. He smiled gently. Then we have ruled well. When the time finally came for the story to be written into the royal records, the court historians hesitated. How does one write a legend that defies categories? In the end, they wrote this. She entered the palace without a name. History would remember she left it having taught a kingdom the meaning of courage. He was born a prince. She made him human. Together they proved that love is not a weakness of tradition, but its greatest evolution. And so the story did not end with a crown, it ended with a truth that sometimes the greatest revolutions do not begin with armies or fire, but with one brave heart choosing another. In the middle of the storm and under the same sky where cherry blossoms still fall, their love lives on, not as rumor, not as scandal, but as legend.